Exposure is good for anxiety, right? It's the gold standard. We face what we fear, we get better. Well, yes, but what if I told you that the vast majority of anxious people who try to do exposure on their own misunderstand and misapply this principle? They wind up feeling frustrated, defeated, and they give up. Let's talk about that right now. It's true. Exposure is part of the gold standard in the way we approach and treat chronic and disordered forms of anxiety. It's supported by decades of data and research. There's no question about that. But there's also no question about the fact that in self-help circles, exposure is one of the most misunderstood and misapplied principles in this entire context, probably alongside acceptance, but that's for another episode. Today on episode 323 of The Anxious Truth, I want to talk about why we get exposure wrong so often, especially when we're trying to do it on our own. Sometimes even when we're working with a therapist that doesn't really understand the principles of exposure. Anyway, I am Drew Linsalata. I am creator and host of The Anxious Truth. Welcome to the podcast or the YouTube channel. If you are new here, you just sort of accidentally stumbled upon us today, welcome. I hope you find what we're doing here useful or applicable in some way. And of course, if you are a returning listener or viewer on YouTube, welcome back. Thank you for spending some time with me. I appreciate it. Before we get into today's topic, which is exposure, common myths, common misconceptions, common mistakes, and why understanding this is powerful and can help you leverage this concept, I just want to remind you that The Anxious Truth is more than just this video or this podcast episode. There's way more resources on my website at theanxioustruth.com. So go ahead and check that out. Most of them are free. Those that do carry a cost are very low cost, including the 3 books that I've written. So hit theanxioustruth.com and check that out. And while we're on the topic of exposure, myths, misconceptions, and mistakes, on September 4th, 2025, I'm doing an Exposure Explained workshop. That is in fact a live event. That's 2 hours, including a Q&A period on exposure. It'll go into much more detail than I can do in a 15 or 20-minute podcast episode. You'll find that on my website as well. But if you go to theanxioustruth.com/exposure, it'll take you right to the page for the workshop. If you can make it on September 4th, 2025 live, would love to have you. If you can't make it, you can always buy it on a replay after that. Again, everything is always very low cost. These are not hundreds of dollars. This will probably cost you somewhere between 30 and 40 or 50 bucks. I promise to keep the cost low, but 2 hours worth of a lot of information, the theory, the mechanics behind it, examples, Q&A on exposure. It's all there. Go to theanxioustruth.com/exposure and check it out. So let's talk about exposure. Yes, exposure is good for anxiety. People often recognize it as the idea of facing their fear. And that is true. It is in fact the process of facing your fear. But sometimes we oversimplify that, or we misunderstand what that means, or we make the mistake of applying it in the wrong way, or actually going about the process of doing exposure in the wrong way. And then we can wind up stuck or frustrated or feeling defeated or hopeless. And then often people give up and say, exposure doesn't work for me. Now, it's true, exposure is a big ask for anybody. It's not guaranteed to work, but it is in fact the treatment that has the most positive outcomes when we study very large numbers of people over very long periods of time. But if you do it incorrectly because you misapply the principle, or you don't understand the principles, or you're just not exactly sure how it's supposed to work, which is understandable, because if you're watching this video or listening to the podcast, you're likely not a therapist. You're likely not trained to do this. So mistakes are going to happen. But if we don't do it the right way with the right principles in mind and the right theory underneath it, we can kind of get trapped into thinking like, this doesn't work for me and I'm hopeless, which is not really true. So what is exposure? Well, exposure is pretty much what the word says. It's being exposed to a thing. What am I being exposed to? You're being exposed to what you fear. So in this situation, we're being exposed to the things that we fear or hate or prefer to otherwise avoid, right? So why do we do this? We want to come in contact with these things that we hate or fear or would otherwise want to avoid or control or prevent, so that we can learn from those experiences. This is going to be really important, because exposure isn't about character building. It's not about being a warrior. It's not about being strong. I mean, it does require courage and strength for sure, but exposure is about learning. It's an experiential learning technique. You got to keep that in mind as we go through this. Again, in the workshop that I'm doing, we're going to go into greater detail in terms of the theory behind this and the mechanics behind it, but know that exposure is something that we do to learn. So what are you being exposed to? The feelings. This is the first mistake that I see people make, the first myth, the first misconception, the first misapplication. You are being exposed to the way you feel. In chronic and disordered states of anxiety and things like OCD, health anxiety, social anxiety, it would seem like what you're being exposed to is possible contamination, or the exposure is driving on the highway, or exposure is being home alone for a few hours, or exposure is attending, a party where there's going to be a lot of people there and your social anxiety might make it difficult for you to do that. But that's not the exposure. The exposure is the feelings. The exposure in our context is the internal experience. This is really important because the exposure isn't going to a supermarket or driving on the highway. The exposure is how you feel when you do those things. This is important. We are exposing ourselves to very difficult, hard to handle, difficult to tolerate internal experiences. That means thoughts that are really scary. If your anxiety tends to be driven by thoughts, it could mean big emotions like fear is the biggest one in our context that fool you into thinking that something is seriously wrong that needs to be avoided or fixed, or physical sensations. So thoughts, emotions, physical sensations, internal things that you experience inside you. That's the exposure. Really important. The thing you do to create those feelings is only a trigger. We don't really necessarily care what the trigger is. As your therapist, if I was your therapist, I wouldn't really necessarily be interested in the triggers, except as a means to get you in touch and in contact with the internal experience. So in our context, the exposure is to what you feel inside. Very important. Keep that in mind. How is exposure supposed to work? Well, there are really two mechanisms at play. The first one is the one we kind of all understand. That's called habituation. Habituation is essentially what happens if you repeat something enough times, even difficult, challenging, and unpleasant experiences, you get used to it. Habituation is kind of getting used to it. So, for instance, people who wind up incarcerated get used to that. That's not normal. They don't want to be there. They certainly would like to not be incarcerated, but it becomes their normal. Repeat something enough times, and humans have this uncanny ability to adapt and habituate to their environment, their circumstances, and their surroundings. We're so good at it that often we start to view even abusive or like hurtful environments as normal, and we stay in them. We choose to stay in them. Like, that's how powerful habituation is. It makes us incredibly adaptable. It makes us able to like rise to the top of the food chain. And when we do exposure, we are certainly using habituation to a certain extent. Now, in the old days, habituation just repeated enough times so that you get used to it and therefore are less anxious when you do that exposure thing was the primary mechanism that we used. And it's true, it would kind of work, but it has serious limitations. If you rely only on habituation, then you run the risk of not being able to learn from the experiences. All you learn is, I repeat it, I push through, I get used to it, I could do it without feeling so bad. But then when it comes time to do another life thing or face another triggering context, you think you're not prepared for that. So habituation is a problem because it doesn't let us generalize one experience to another. That's critical. And when I say exposure isn't about pushing through, habituation isn't about pushing through, it leads us to mechanism number two, which is called inhibitory learning. We learn through inhibition. Well, what do we learn? We learn that we can, in fact, float through, accept, willfully tolerate that really uncomfortable or distressing or terrifying internal state. Remember, the exposure is to the internal experience. We learn inhibitory learning that we can actually handle that when we previously thought we can't possibly handle it and we have to stop it, prevent it, get away from it, control it, wrestle it to the ground, whatever that happens to be. We learn through inhibition. What do we inhibit? We inhibit the knee-jerk reflexive resistant response that you otherwise would engage in when you are triggered. So in inhibitory learning, you want to think about, what do you do when you start to have really scary thoughts about maybe self-harm or about doing something immoral or being a bad person? What do you do when you start to recognize sensations in your body that you fear so much because you keep insisting that it's a sign of a stroke or a heart attack or some other horrible thing passing out, even though those things don't happen? What happens when you start to have scary thoughts that indicate you must take immediate action because you're feeling a big emotion like fear or feeling vulnerable, and you feel like it's not even a question. I have to get away from this feeling. I have to stop it. I have to prevent it. I have to avoid it. If you can see the things that you normally do or refuse to do when you are triggered, Now you have a foothold in inhibitory learning. We inhibit that response. We don't do the saving thing. We don't do the escape thing. We don't do the reassuring thing. We don't do the avoidant thing. And we come through the other side anyway. That's really important. We learn that when we inhibit that response, we still come out the other side, and we essentially learn that we can, in fact, accept, tolerate, float through, navigate through, surrender to those things that we previously thought were absolutely off limits and we should never allow to happen. Now, why does this work? Well, because in both mechanisms, we are relying on the unassailable truth. This is one of those foundational principles that if you want to disagree with, then exposure isn't going to be for you. We rely on the unassailable truth that all internal human experiences are transient, every last one of them. If you've ever been scared, if you've ever been anxious, if you've ever been really happy, if you've ever been joyful, if you've ever been regretful, if you've ever been angry, if you've ever been sad, if you've ever been guilty, that experience has ended. You could think of a million times in your life that you have felt sad, or maybe you felt regret, or maybe you've been angry. Are you experiencing those emotions right now? No, you might be experiencing one of those emotions right now, but it's not the same episode of the emotion that you remembered just now when I sort of asked you to think about that. Every internal human experience ends. Your brain is not wired to stay laser focused on one feeling, one thought, or one idea for long periods of time. That would be bad. We can't have it do that. There's an entire cottage industry, and by the way, there has been since we invented language, all dedicated to trying to teach people how to be focused. Right now we have like a ton of books about slow productivity and deep focus and deep work. Mindfulness is used as a weapon to try to teach people how to pay attention and stay focused. You got to focus, focus, focus. We use it as like a virtue. Why do we have to learn to focus? Because your brain is not designed to pay attention to thoughts, emotions, feelings for any extended period of time. If we leave it alone, the experience will end and we will go on to the next experience. This is a foundational truth principle underneath exposure. If you want to do exposure, but you want to insist that your panic may never end, or your fear may never go away, or you will wind up stuck in this forever if you don't take evasive action, you would be wrong, at least from where I sit and where most trained people sit, and you would have to abandon the idea that exposure is for you. Habituation only works because of this principle. You only get used to a thing that you repeat again and again and again because the experience of that difficult internal state peaks and then falls. It peaks and then falls. It peaks and then falls. Habituation is what happens when the peak happens quickly and the fall happens quickly. And then the peak gets a little lower and the fall happens quickly. And then you have barely a peak at all. And then you stop being triggered in the least. This mechanism is underneath getting used to anything. So this is why it works. And inhibitory learning, we are invoking that principle intentionally. I'm not going to take evasive action. I'm going to let this experience rise and fall organically on its own because all internal human experiences do that if left alone. And I am going to paint my anxious brain into a corner so it has no other conclusion that it could possibly reach than, oh, this really will end if I don't do anything at all. So if you are convinced that calling your safe person or tapping on your cheek or getting an ice pack or counting backwards from 100 by sevens or reciting your children's birthdays to prove that you're not losing your memory, if those are the only things and you must do those things to be okay or else disaster will strike, you would be wrong. And we need to rely on this principle when we do exposure and use these two mechanisms of habituation and inhibitory learning. Right? So very, very important. Very, very important. The next thing that comes up is that people will say, but exposure is so scary. And that is correct. I hate this part, but it is in fact true. Exposure is scary. It's difficult. It's challenging. It requires courage. It requires some strength. It requires a commitment to these principles. So don't let anybody tell you that exposure is fast and easy. It's not. It's as difficult. No human being wants to intentionally be triggered. We don't intentionally choose to be uncomfortable, afraid, or feeling distressed. So it is true that exposure is in fact scary. But the second major mistake, or a major mistake that people tend to make when trying to use exposure or apply the principles of exposure, especially in a self-help context, is that they try to do exposure without being scared. But It will never work that way. Remember that the exposure is to the internal state, and the internal state generally means thoughts or emotions or physical sensations that are accompanied by feelings of distress, disturbance, or fear. We need that fear. The exposure is designed to trigger the fear. So if your objection to exposure is, but it's really scary, I would say that's not really an objection. That's an observation. Like, it's true that exposure is really scary. If you're trying really hard to learn how to do exposure, but you're also at the same time trying to make it less scary, you could stop doing that. That was never going to work and will never work. The exposure is supposed to be scary. Exposure isn't about learning how to live your life without being anxious. Exposure is about learning that you can be anxious and also do life. That doesn't mean that you have to be anxious for the rest of your life while you do that life. But for now, we need that intentional experience to teach us that we do not have to run from our internal experiences. We don't have to fear and try to control our own bodies and minds and thoughts to be okay. Once we can learn that, we can sort of get back to life and not worry about being triggered so often or so severely, or in some cases at all. But remember, we're not shooting to get rid of all anxiety, fear, or discomfort forever. That would be impossible. But when we learn that, like, oh, I can be scared and still have lunch with a friend, a lot of things really change. So remember, the exposure is supposed to be scary. It's not news if you say, but it's really scary, or like, oh, I have to be so brave to do that. That is correct. Hate that part, but that is true. Again, we're going to go into much greater detail on this. We're going to give all kinds of examples, and we'll be able to do a Q&A on the exposure workshop that I'm doing on September 4th, 2025. Of course, if you're in the future and missed that date, it's available on a replay. Go to my website and check it out. The next error that I want to address, or the next mistake or misconception, is that you have to try to control the experience. That is not true. So people try to do exposures. They choose to be intentionally triggered because that's what an exposure is designed to do. And either they make the previous error and they won't do the exposure because they're too afraid. They can't get rid of the fear, so they feel like they can't do the exposure. That's a mistake. Or they say, okay, I got to go and face my fear. So they're willing to accept that they're going to be afraid, but then they launch into all kinds of like control, avoidance, and escape strategies during the exposure to try to control that internal experience. That's a mistake. That renders the exposure kind of a moot point. So if you're going to choose to intentionally be afraid, go do an exposure, which is a really brave choice to make. And I commend you if you're doing that at all. That's a step forward for sure. Remember that we don't do that and then try to control the internal experience. We need to let the internal experience play itself out naturally or organically. We need to rely on that unassailable foundational truth that I talk about, that all experiences, even the really difficult and scary ones, are transient in nature. We need that to be on full display. So if we go and intentionally trigger the thing that we hate inside of us, good job for being brave, but you got to do the next brave thing, which is that inhibitory learning part. It's not about gritting your teeth, like doing all the control stuff, tapping like crazy, calling a safe person to talk you through and pushing through until you get back to the other side. It's about allowing yourself to be afraid, to be disturbed, to have the thoughts, to have the sensations. That ain't easy, but that's what this is about. The big mistake that people make is they try to do exposures. They understand they're going to be scary, and then they try to control their fear or prevent or stop or make it go away or somehow mediate it or modulate it through some sort of active, whether it's a cognitive or behavioral thing. And then the exposure actually winds up being kind of useless. In fact, not only is it useless, it can backfire. Because if you go and do a scary thing for the purposes of doing the scary thing, because you understand that that's the way to get better, that's awesome. But if you do the scary thing and bring your ice pack or your safe person or your mints or your Xanax or your whatever, like there's a zillion different safety, control, and escape mechanisms. I can't name them all. You have to recognize your own. If you bring those things into that experience and then use them to get yourself through the experience, you don't get any credit. You learn nothing from that. You only learn that I can only drive on the highway if I have a bottle of ice cold water, mints, and my partner on speed dial, for instance. That's not an exposure. In fact, that teaches you that you can't do the thing, that you have to do the safety behaviors. You have to do the avoidance. You don't want to learn that. You're trying to like learn a different way. So in this situation, we have to be very careful because we could accidentally cement the disordered and chronic anxious state in place if we do it that way, right? So third major mistake, stop trying to control the internal experience while you do the exposure. You're doing the exposure to have the experience, not to try to control it. You need to let it play out organically. All right. So let's move on to the next thing. This isn't really necessarily a mistake, but it's just a misunderstanding. It's the doing versus not doing thing. So if you're listening to this or watching this video and you have, say, panic disorder or agoraphobia, you kind of understand what exposure means. It means, oh, I'm afraid to drive on the highway, for instance, or I'm afraid to be home alone, or I'm afraid to go too far from the house, because when I do that, that difficult internal experience is triggered and I don't like that. So I run back home, or I refuse to leave at all. I avoid the experience. So in that situation, the exposure is predominantly centered on doing, right? We do a thing to go into the experience, to put ourselves into direct contact with the internal experience that we fear, hate, and normally avoid. But in other presentations like OCD or GAD or often health anxiety, the exposure is a little bit more about not doing. Now, in the end, because of inhibitory learning principles, we're always trying to not do. That's true. We're trying to not do the saving, escaping, soothing, reassuring, talking ourselves down behavior. So exposure is kind of always about not doing. The inhibition in inhibitory learning is a not doing thing. But some exposures are based on the fact that you're doing a thing that will trigger you. Some exposures are based on not doing the thing that knocks down the triggered state. So the person with agoraphobia intentionally leaves the house, goes out of their comfort zone without their safe person to be triggered, and then to work through that without saving themselves. The person with GAD, for instance, is having an absolute storm of thoughts about being perfectionistic, about being in control of other people's experiences, about being responsible for everybody else's happiness, about being prepared, about being a problem solver or a multitasker, because that's what they really want to be in life. And what they wind up doing is jumping headfirst into ruminative, perseverative, looping thinking, cognitive or mental compulsions or rituals, which are often found in OCD also, to try to bring down the discomfort. Oh my goodness, I don't know how this is going to turn out. So I'll think about it more for the next 6 hours, to the point of exhaustion and frustration, because I don't like the internal experience of not knowing, being unsure, having questions left unanswered, accepting that I can't solve this problem or know this reality, not know the future, not solve this problem. So in other presentations, predominantly we see it in OCD, GAD, or health anxiety, the experience is about not doing. You don't have to do a thing to get triggered. You're going to get triggered anyway. And then you have to do the not doing, which is the inhibition. I really, really want to ruminate on this, because the rumination is the avoidance, right? The looping through thinking is the avoidance. The asking for reassurance is the avoidance. The Googling to see if you can answer the question about your health is the avoidance. So sometimes people make the mistake, especially with GAD or certain types of OCD, they'll say, yeah, but if I walk away from this problem, aren't I avoiding the problem? No, remember, the exposure is to your internal state. The exposure isn't at all the question about your children's health, for instance. That's not the exposure at all. That's the thing that triggers a very uncomfortable internal state. So when that internal state is triggered, you will want to go directly at what you say is a problem, so that you can try to solve it or gain some sort of certainty, so you can get away from the internal experience. Very tricky. This is why working with a trained therapist or a counselor is really helpful in this situation. I cannot tell you how many people who suffer from GAD or certain presentations of OCD that will tell me, but if I walk away from the rumination or the problem solving, isn't that avoiding? No, it's actually not. You problem solve to avoid the bad feeling that you get inside you. Really important. So sometimes exposure is about doing, sometimes it's about not doing. It's always about not doing in the inhibition part, where we eliminate the soothing, safety, reassuring escape behaviors like rumination or driving home right away as soon as you're going to panic. But you have to kind of know the difference between the doing and the not doing thing. It's tough. I can't exactly give you the answer in a podcast episode. Yeah, and you might want to check out the exposure workshop. I'll try to go into greater detail on that. I'll put a link in the video description or the podcast description. Feel free to check that out. And finally, I think it's important to recognize, I've been at this for 25 minutes now, evidently. It's important to recognize that when it comes to exposure, while I always say knowing is not recovery, reading is not recovery, listening is not recovery, watching videos is not recovery, this is the psychoeducation part. Knowledge really is power. So especially when it comes to the principles, the theory, the mechanics of exposure, like I'm trying to give you a very fast overview of in this episode, like knowledge is power. Like facing your fear is definitely a thing. Doing what scares you, being intentionally triggered, run toward. I don't care how you want to conceptualize it. Yes, it's a definite thing when we're treating and trying to overcome chronic and disordered states of anxiety. However, we need to know the basis of that. We need to understand the theory underneath it. We need to know the mechanisms at play. We need to know the principles and how we apply those things. So while knowledge isn't recovery, knowledge is really essential in learning how to apply these principles in your recovery journey, so you don't accidentally shoot yourself in the foot and wind up needlessly frustrated or declaring yourself hopeless or incapable or impossible to get better. That wouldn't be fair. Again, exposure is not always a guarantee. That's 100% true. I might assert that it is almost always a guarantee, but the problem would be sometimes it gets very nuanced and very specific, and you really need a very long time working with somebody who's qualified and experienced, who can guide you through that stuff to get to the point where you can apply the principles of exposure well. If you're doing it just by scrolling through TikTok and Instagram and learning, oh, look, I got to accept face, I got to float, I got to run toward, and then you just try to do that without understanding all this, things can kind of go south, and we don't want that to happen. No, there's no reason to make things any worse than they already are, because this is difficult enough as it is, right? So knowledge is power here. And again, I know I'm sounding like a crazy sales pitch, but the exposure workshop can be really helpful because I get so many questions about this, and I can't keep answering the same questions again and again and again and again in the comment section on multiple platforms. So I put stuff like this together because I can be much more detailed in a 2-hour presentation than I can in a podcast or in a 90-second reel or YouTube short. Right. So there's a reason why I do things like the exposure workshops. Again, you can go to theanxioustruth.com/exposure. It'll get you over to the page for that. Use it. Don't use it. It's okay. I'm not going to be bothered if you don't buy a ticket to the exposure workshop. That's really okay. I get it. I'm not here to just try and extract money from you. I'm trying to give you useful things. Maybe this podcast episode by itself is useful enough, and that would be really awesome. If you could adjust and use these principles for free just by listening or watching, then I'm thrilled by that. But if you think you need a little more, that would be a way to get it. And that's it. That's episode 323 of The Anxious Truth, sort of in the books. This is the way I end all of them. I don't know how much fancy editing and music I'm going to have at the end, but remember that exposure, yes, it's a thing. Yes, it's a core principle that we rely on when we overcome anxiety disorders, but we have to really understand it a little better, and we have to use it in a correct way. If you're working with a therapist and that therapist isn't maybe necessarily well-versed in the principles of exposure, they might be steering you wrong, even though they have the best of intentions. If you're trying to do this on your own, or you're trying to do it in the comment section or in community support, which is great to have, but you might be getting some misconceptions also. So that's why I wanted to put this out there. I hope what you heard today or watched today is going to be useful, and maybe it will help you make a little bit of a correction, and maybe it'll help you apply these principles in a little bit more of a helpful way and a useful way in your own situation. So I appreciate you stopping by to listen or watch and giving me your time. It's always really appreciated, no matter how you support this podcast or this YouTube channel. Just hanging out and watching and listening means the world to me. So I will ask, though, if you're listening as a podcast episode on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and you can leave a rating or a review, maybe leave a 5-star rating if you dig it, or take a second and write a review of the podcast, because that helps other people actually find it. And that's why I do this to begin with, try and help people. And of course, if you're watching as a YouTube video and you're not subscribed to my YouTube channel, why not just hit the little subscribe button? It's a click for you, means a lot for me, because it tells YouTube that you actually care that I take the time to make these videos, which are kind of time consuming sometimes. But if you do none of those things and you just watch and listen and walk away and somehow apply these things and maybe get a little better, then I'm happy with that too. That's totally cool. So remember, no matter how small the change is that you might make today, maybe it's in applying principles of exposure. Maybe it's in just gaining a little bit more acceptance of the fact that you can, in fact, tolerate things that you have insisted were intolerable. If you just open your mind a little bit today, a little bit more than it was yesterday, to the idea that going toward your fear might actually be useful, then you're winning. Every little change you make, whether it's in your attitude or in your beliefs or in your openness or in your flexibility or in your actual behaviors, every little change you make matters. They all add up. They get you to where you want to be. They count. Be patient. Let it happen. Be kind to yourself along the way. Really important. Be careful of Craig the Critic. If you listen to the Disordered podcast, that's disordered.fm. You hear Craig the Critic there all the time. But these things all count. Keep going. Keep letting them add up. Keep being nice to yourself while you do it. Thanks for listening or watching today. I will see you in 2 weeks with another topic. Don't know what that's going to be, but I'll be here. We're out.